Hello, JBS viewers. Welcome to the ISGAP Hour. I'm David Harris, Executive Vice Chair, and as always, I'm joined by the visionary founder and CEO of ISGAP, Charles Small. ISGAP, for those of you who are hearing about it for the first time, is an acronym for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which Charles Small created and which today Natan Sharansky, a legendary figure among the Jewish people, chairs. And for our special guest today, there's a connection between Charles and him. So Charles, let me hand over the virtual microphone.
Okay, thank you, David. David Suissa, welcome to the ISGAP Hour. We're honored that you're here. For our viewers, David Suissa is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Jewish Journal, which in my view, I know is the largest Jewish newspaper in the United States. And I think it's one of the most vibrant papers in the country that David really created and nourished for many years. David was actually born in Morocco, but grew up in my hometown of Montreal, and now he's based in Los Angeles. So David, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
It's great to be here, Charles and David.
So David, from your perspective, we're in the perhaps the final kinetic chapter of the kinetic war with Iran. Given what's been going on in the last few weeks, could you comment on your views of the war against radical Islam, Hamas, Hezbollah, Assad, and now Iran? What's your take on the recent developments?
Well, as someone who's immersed in the news business, I think it's important to make a distinction between the noise and the essential things. In the noise, we hear a lot of political partisanship, people who love Trump, who hate Trump, isolationist, whether there's going to be a ceasefire or not, whether the ceasefire is going to hold. All those things I consider noise. And it's obscuring the essential fact on the ground, which is that the biggest threat to Israel and to much of the Western world has been tremendously weakened, not just in the past 12 days, but in the past year and a half since October 7th. So when you look at Iran, for the past 30 years, many of us have considered it the number one threat. They're the number one sponsor of terror around the world. And as we all know all too well, they've been threatening to eliminate the Jewish state. That was their mission. And then here we find ourselves in the year 2025. It's almost unbelievable, the situation we're in, that this incredible lethal threat has been so weakened. And when I say weakened, I include the terror proxies from Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria and Yemen and Iraq. And then you see how weak and isolated the Iran regime is today. China, Russia has not come to its help. So the noise is covering up this essential fact. And the people who really understand this better than anyone are the Israelis. They understand that what's happened since October 7th, which I consider the day that Israel hit rock bottom on October 7, 2023, we cannot overstate the monumental security breakdown that happened on that day. It is the day that Israel lost its mystique and lost its deterrence. It hit rock bottom. And when you compare where we are today versus that day, it's an extraordinary development that we cannot overlook.
I agree. So when I agree with you that Israel lost its deterrence on October the 7th, 2023, for sure, and it was rock bottom. And then, on October the 8th, we saw the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and North America on the streets of the United States. This sort of, I think we drew a correlation between the deterrence that Israel enjoyed for many decades and its loss on October 7th to the rise of anti-Semitism. Our enemies saw Israel and the Jewish people as weak, and there was this explosion of anti-Semitism. Do you think that now that perhaps the deterrence is being reestablished, what Israel has done in the kinetic warfare is incredible, at so many levels. Do you think that this will translate in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, that this will put a halt to some of the anti-Semitism that seems to be all around us?
Well, Charles and David, one of the things we've learned to our great sadness through the millennia is that the haters will always find an excuse to hate us. After October 7th, Israel was at its weakest point. You would think that if there was one time when people's hearts would offer some sympathy for Israel, that would be it. It was the opposite. They smell blood, and it became open season on Israel. So now that Israel has regained its mystique, has regained its position as a fearsome force in the Middle East, I don't anticipate any change whatsoever, because the haters are going to hate. And it's one of the kind of sad realities that we live with today. And as you've documented so well, we see it increasing right now. And it's one of the tragic parts of Jewish history is that after Israel hit its lowest point on October 7th, we've been seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. But I'd like to discuss, over the next hour, how we can address it. I won't say everything in one answer, but no, to answer your question specifically, I don't anticipate any improvement whatsoever now that Israel has regained its stature in the Middle East.
So, David, let's pick up exactly there. If, for argument's sake, you could wave a magic wand in two directions. One direction would be towards elected officials in Washington, in Sacramento, wherever, Los Angeles, and say, this is what I hope you will do as elected officials, as leaders in the United States to combat anti-Semitism. What would you say to them? And with the other magic wand, to the Jewish community. Are we addressing the problem in the right ways from your perspective? We have lots of organizations spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Are we helping our cause? Are we hurting our cause? What does David Suissa think?
I'm glad you asked.
And by the way, viewers, this is completely unscripted.
Do you have 3 hours? I've spent a good part of my adult life pondering that question. I might have written 150 columns, without exaggerating, on that subject. But I'm going to give it my best shot to summarize, where I'm at on that. In fact, my first answer that I gave on what Israel has done, which is focus on facts on the ground to beat back its enemies and regain its deterrence. Israel, went away from the idea of being loved by the world, of making arguments and kind of creating a situation where we need to have great asbara. We hear asbara all the time. Instead of asbara, after October 7th, Israel realized we should not waste our time with asbara. Right now, what we need is something concrete, what my Ashkenazi friends call tachlis. And Israel has been in a complete tachlis mode since October 7th, and look where it is today. I think we need to borrow a page out of that approach, what I call the tachlis approach. So when you ask if I had a magic wand, and what would I tell the leaders, our elected officials, I would tell them, do not go against free speech. Free speech is one of the great foundational ideas of this country that I love, America. Jews do not want to be known as the people who destroyed free speech because we consider it anti-Semitic. The First Amendment does not call hate speech illegal. It protects hate speech. It protects horrible speech. It protects offensive speech. I prefer to tell those elected officials, use the law to protect Jews. And the laws are there, and there are tremendous laws and tremendous regulations. So my approach should be all tachlis. as far as the Jewish people themselves here in America, I think a similar approach should be taken. Organizations like Charles Small, ISGAP, like the ones that you guys represent, you provide us with tremendous amount of information. Based on that information, I think we ought to put a full court press. I think the new heroes of the Jewish world in the fight against anti-Semitism should be the lawyers, should be the legal approach. Because when you do that, you have a real choice of victories. If all we do is condemn, complain, and label, these are not real victories. I never liked the label anti-Semitic because it's so hard to prove and it becomes nebulous. But if you go into a courthouse and you say, this action is illegal, harassment is illegal, intimidation is illegal, this violates rules. So as a Sephardic who's supposed to be really emotional, I'm channeling my inner Ashkenazi and saying that we need a more tachlis approach to fighting back against the haters.
And are you seeing, with your second magic wand directed at the Jewish community, are people listening? You've written scores of columns, you said. I'm sure given many speeches, David. Are people listening from your perspective? Do you see it?
Well,
I see it from the students. I see it from some great students.
I see it partly, but remember the expression from Watergate, follow the money? When you follow the money, you realize that when you look at fundraising, so much of fundraising is based on fear, on alarmism, on victimhood, and asbara and demonstrations, and all those things that are not tachlis. It's emotional stuff. And tens of millions of dollars are going to that place, which is not practical and doesn't give us victories. So I cannot tell you how often I get emails on condemnations. We must educate. All these things are what I call soft ways of fighting. And we've tried it for so long, and it doesn't seem to work. The thing that I really think works is when we speak softly and carry a big stick. And that big stick needs to be the legal world. Now, let's talk about the noise we make, right? If we're not going to make a noise around condemnations, then what do we replace it with? I think we replace it with the opposite of anti-Semitism, which is pro-Semitism. What's gotten lost in the picture is that there is a long-time love affair between the Jews and America. There is no group in this country that has given back more to America than the Jews. So when we complain and condemn anti-Semitism, we make it look like this country hates the Jews. It's not true. For 100 years, Jewish comedians have made America laugh. Jewish social justice warriors, Jewish, literary giants, scientists, everywhere you look, every nook and cranny of American society, you find that Jews have helped this country. If anything, Jews should be admired and loved. All that has gotten lost in the picture. So, I spent many years in the advertising business, so I have a fondness for the expression branding, the idea of a brand. And the Jewish brand in recent years has shrunk. We look like we're complaining all the time about the fact that people hate us. By the way, it may be true, but we can't forget the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that it's not the only part of our story right now. And I worry sometimes that in all the noise about anti-Semitism, the core truth of pro-Semitism gets lost in the picture.
Charles?
Yeah, David, I agree. And I think, picking up on that very important point, and we've discussed this in the past, at ISGAP, one of our projects is called Jewish Consciousness, trying to shift the discourse, because I think our enemies are defining us as well. The Nazis said we were not white and they killed us, and now the intellectual, I call them intellectual clowns, are now saying that we're white and we're white supremacists, and it's incredible how this sort of irrationality, but our enemies are defining us. And I think the wisdom that we have, in who we are as a people, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive the other, how, the ethics of that's rooted in Pirkei Avot and our teachings, I also think is being lost. So can you comment on that? I know you read well and you're schooled in our wisdom.
Yes, I can. And I think the essential point I'd like to make on that, Charles, is that Jews in America need to start expressing their deep love for America. And the trap we don't want to fall into is that we become worried only about our own. And I say that because it's not accurate. We care about this country. And the best thing I think we can do for Jews right now is to express our love for America. We don't just want to help Jews. We want to help America. And whatever America needs, we are here to help. Unfortunately, this country has become so politically polarized that even the idea of loving America has become a Republican idea. I have friends of mine who are, Democrats, and I'm an independent, and you'll rarely see them talk about America. They won't have an American flag on July 4th. It's something that's gotten lost in the picture. The idea of the American dream. And I think the best thing that Jews can do, and you are two great people, by the way, and I know that David Harris, you've been a great leader of the Jewish community for so many years. And this idea of Jews rising up, saying how much we love this country, and we are here to help this country on all fronts, which is what we've done since the beginning. We need to start publicizing what we are doing to help this great country.
David, I want to switch gears a little bit from what you just said so eloquently and passionately. California, in many respects, is ground zero for the progressive movements in the United States. You, David Suissa, are a veteran both of journalism and, as you said, of advertising. You talk about the branding challenge. Why have we had such a difficult time, from your perspective, in making the case for Israel and, if you will, for the Jewish people with the liberal/progressive community? And more than diagnosing it, do you have some ideas, again, back to the magic wand, for how do we rebrand ourselves, if you will, or re-engage with the so-called progressive community in California, in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, in school systems like the University of California system, in the minority communities that now form the majority population in the state of California? What haven't we done, or what have we been doing wrong?
Well, I think the first thing is to stop focusing so much on anti-Semitism and start focusing on how we want to help this great state of California. As far as why the progressive world has fallen so hard on the Jews, we caught what I call a perfect storm of circumstances when the woke movement decided that being successful is a sign of white privilege. And the truth is that Jews are successful. So we got caught up in this idea of success is white privilege, being white is a negative, being Western is a negative, being powerful is a negative. And you look at a state like Israel, which is the Jewish state. So anytime there's a criticism of Israel, there's an implicit criticism of the Jews. So you look at Israel as the ultimate example of white, Western, powerful, colonialist, and all those negative things that have become so distasteful and hated in the past few years, especially. So we got caught in that whirlwind. The Jews did. And all of a sudden, it was very hard to become popular because, we checked all the boxes of being unpopular. So this is how we got caught in that trap of progressive hatred. Now, as far as, moving forward, I want to go back to that idea that here, the Jews of LA, we love LA and we love California. And I think too often when we had the, defund the police, and we had these ideas that Jewish Democrats really didn't like, but they kept their mouth shut because they're so politicized that they wouldn't say anything because they were afraid that it would help Republicans. And I think we need to shed that political obsession with our parties, and we need to start thinking, if we live in California, what's best for LA, what's best for California, and what's best for America? I know it sounds like an idealist approach, but really it's the only way. Now there are really anti-Semitic strains in the curriculum of the high schools here in California. And it's good that we fight them. And we should fight them with what I said at the beginning of this conversation, with the Tachlis approach. And we have groups that are doing that. But when we do that, we should do it in the name of truth, because the lies and the propaganda that are being taught about Jews is not just bad for the Jews. It's bad for the sake of truth. Education needs to be a sacred endeavor for the search of truth. So anything we do needs to be framed in a moral way that has a universal appeal.
Charles?
So thank you, David. So also shifting the focus a little bit, as I said earlier, you're from Montreal, you're from Canada, or you grew up in Canada and in Montreal. Tomorrow, ISGAP is releasing a major report on the Canadian context, on the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood into Canada. And I think in a way, I would make the argument that Canada was sort of ahead of the curve in terms of rising anti-Semitism and rising, I guess, anti-Western, anti-democratic politics, sort of the Red-Green Alliance. And I know you still have family and you're still connected to Montreal and to Canada. For the American viewers of JBS, what's your takeaway? What are the lessons that we can learn from the Canadian context that are applicable to the challenges we face here?
Well, I have to tell you, it's horrible right now in Montreal. There's been a tremendous wave of anti-Semitism expressed through anti-Israelism and globalized the Intifada and harassment. It's really ugly. And this is not something that I experienced growing up in Montreal, but there's been a tremendous influx of immigration from Muslim countries. And they're now in Montreal. And there's a certain chutzpah, this idea that the Jews can handle it, that I never pay a price for attacking Jews. This sense that there are no consequences, and you can feel it. You can feel it at my alma mater, McGill University, where I see these demonstrators stopping students from entering my former school, the Bronfman building. I see these videos, and it really saddens me. So I think what you're doing at ISGAP is absolutely critical for the simple reason that you don't do activism. You do real deep research with credible facts so that when the powers that be want to do something about it, they know exactly where to target. But I wish I can give you some good news about Montreal, but I can't. And it's bad and it's getting worse.
Yeah, I agree. I spent Pesach there, and on the second Seder, it's just a brief story, I sat with my parents and my sister and her friends, and my grandparents, when they came to Canada, they had a group of friends. My parents were friends with the children, I was friends with the grandchildren, and now my nephews are friends with the great-grandchildren. And these are proud Jewish Montreal Quebecois people.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, just to finish the story. So these are proud Jews, proud Canadians, and they're taking the mezuzahs off the door because it's no longer safe. And the conversation around the Seder table, I did not recognize the city, that I grew up in and the city and the country that I love. It's really a crisis right now.
You know, I have to say something painful, but true. We don't like to fight that much.
Yeah.
When I grew up in Montreal, the last thing I wanted to do was fight. Montreal, like the joie de vivre and the nightlife, you study, the idea of fighting was really anathema to most Jews. It was not something that we got involved with. I'll tell you a story about my daughter from NYU. After October 7th, obviously we know that the situation got really heated on college campuses. And my daughter is a sweet kid. She loves to dance and she's an artist and she's as sweet as can be, right? But she loves Israel. So she started putting up these posters of hostages around her campus. And I spoke to her one day and I said, "How's it going, sweetie?" And she said, "Well, we were putting up these posters of hostages and then these mean people came and they tore them down." So I said, "Well, Eva, what are you going to do?" She said, "Well, me and a group of friends, we're going to go find stronger glue." This is how she fought. She's going to get stronger glue. So when you go back to Montreal and I sit down in those same Seder tables as you did, and those same Shabbat tables as you did, I find a group of Jews who are not looking forward to fighting. They're a little stunned. They're a little numb from this. And unfortunately, sometimes we got to stand up and fight, but it's not our first choice. It's something that we do as a last resort. And you know what? There's a part of me that's really proud of that. I don't want the Jews to become warriors as a first resort. I like the fact that fighting for us is a last resort, but you need to understand that the people we are against, and you see the protesters on college campuses, I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but there's a glee, there's a chutzpah, there's a absolute intent of being hostile. This is not something that people are doing grudgingly. And you see the hate on college campuses. It's gotten a little better now, because I think a lot of those campuses, especially the Ivy Leagues, they cracked down on it this year. But the hatred that we see here in Los Angeles, whenever I go to one of these demonstrations, they're not fighting grudgingly. There's no intent that they're really fighting for the Palestinian cause. It's anti-Jewish, it's anti-Israel, and it's really angry. And I don't see in that anger any desire to help a cause. This is not the 60s when, people would demonstrate on the street because 50,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam, and the rights of blacks in the South, civil rights. There was a nobility during those demonstrations that I don't see today. I do not see the nobility of pro-Hamas demonstrations. It doesn't mean they don't have the right to spew their hatred. It's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is they're a tough foe for Jewish students to go up against, precisely because their body language can get so angry and hysterical.
I like that word nobility, Charles. I think it's a very good way of describing the difference for those of us who were at some of those demonstrations in the 60s and 70s versus today. Charles had his focus group, David, at the Passover table in Montreal. You have another focus group. I'm assuming a daily focus group, and that is thousands and thousands of Jews in Los Angeles and beyond who read the Jewish Journal. And I'm wondering, since October the 7th, take us inside. How has the journalism changed? What are you hearing from your constituency? Are they pulling you in the same direction, different directions? more pro-Israel, less pro-Israel? What's going on? That's one heck of a focus group you have.
You know,
More unity in the community?
I was at an event last night, and then I heard someone say, and then October 7th happened, and there was a light bulb that went off in my head. And I said, that would be the great title of a book. And then October 7th happened. As far as journalism in the Jewish world, that's the big picture. And then October 7th happened. There's Jewish life before October 7th and Jewish life after. And the thing that I've seen, you know, I can categorize it in two areas. One is just fear. You know, the hundreds of emails we get from readers, you know, I mean, scientists have studied the human brain. And from way, way back, the brain is wired to look for trouble because we have a survival instinct. So we're going to pay more attention to the tiger that's approaching us than to those delicious berries in the field. We haven't changed. So the brain is wired to look for trouble. And the number one thing I've seen is fear. Fear and looking for trouble. And this is just the way life is. And I know that even in journalism, if I put fear and alarmism in my headlines, we're going to double or triple our clicks, right? So it's the nature of the beast. It doesn't mean that the fear is not justified. What it means is that sometimes it looks a lot worse than it really is. And even in journalism, you know, there is not one section of journalism that has good news, right? We never say good news. And yet, there's a lot of good news. And that's the second part of my answer. And then October 7th happened. I have never seen an epidemic of solidarity like I've seen in the Jewish world since October 7th. I have to tell you, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories have come to us for initiatives from everyone, from a mother in the San Fernando Valley who decides to make clothing for victims. It's just extraordinary what we've seen in terms of the Jewish community rising up to help. So those are the two big elements of what I've seen. And they keep going simultaneously. I see the fear that never stops, and I see the solidarity that also never stops.
Wow.
So David, apropos of that, it's interesting. I know you have good relations in LA beyond the Jewish community. What has your experience been on an individual level, on a personal level, to people from other communities? And also, I guess, vis-a-vis the Jewish Journal, has there been any working with other communities and other intellectuals or journalists in LA or beyond on these matters?
You know, that's such a complicated question. And
that's why I'm here.
I'll tell you why it's complicated. Because we have a tendency to meet face to face with the non-Jews who like us. One of my good friends is Van Jones from CNN. He comes to our Shabbat table all the time. And he's really developed a fondness for the Jews. So I'm constantly exposed to non-Jews who have a connection with us. And they talk about, you know, going to church when they were young and being Israelites and the bond that exists between the Jews and the blacks that goes so far back. You hear all these beautiful things of stuff that we have in common. There's an organization called Creative Community for Peace. I go to these events and I see the bonding between Jews and non-Jews, especially in the black community. I see people like Patricia Heaton. There's a friend of mine, a religious Christian who I spend Shabbat with constantly. He invites me to his Christmas parties. He loves Jews. He loves Israel. One of my closest friends is a Muslim professor at UCLA, a practicing Muslim, Dr. Omar Boum from Morocco. He's one of the world experts on the Jews of Morocco. He also comes to my Shabbat table. I adore him. I call him brother. So the reason it's a complicated question is because I tend to see only the good side, but I also hear the bad side. And in the bad side, that often we see it, I guess, on social media, and we see how, the name of Israel and the connection between Israel and the Jews, and then the news on 40,000 dead in Gaza, which breaks my heart, right? That becomes an albatross around our neck. And for someone who doesn't know that much or doesn't want to know that much, it becomes an easy way of joining the hate wagon against Jews. And despite all the good news I've shared about the people that I meet who have a connection with us, there are many, many, many more who have joined the hate wagon because it's easy. And you don't pay a price in Hollywood or in academia if you bash Israel. You just don't pay a price. So too many have kind of joined in on that, and it's sad.
Hollywood, not that long ago, was seen as a bastion of both Jewish and pro-Israel outlook. I recently asked someone in the business, could Paul Newman and Eva St. Marie appear today in the film Exodus? And they said to me without a moment's hesitation, there's no way the film could be made today. From your vantage point, what's happened in Hollywood to turn the situation around where a Ronald Reagan emerged as such a friend of Israel, not to mention some of the people like Lou Wasserman and other Jews in the business, to a point where we're almost counting on a couple of hands those in Hollywood, Jewish and non-Jewish, who are standing with us unequivocally?
Well, David, I have this terrible habit of I recognize the bad and the darkness, but my heart and my soul goes towards something positive,
Good.
Right? So I'm recognizing the darkness. And I have to tell you, Gaza really, really, really hurt us. And the optimistic part of me is looking now at a different future when Israel will not be caught up in a war where thousands of Palestinians will be killed. By the way, you should know that I've written columns on this where I hold Hamas responsible for the death of Palestinians. That's not something that makes me popular, but I really do believe in it. And the fight that Israel engaged in Gaza was incredibly difficult, and it was bound to backfire on us in terms of our image and our reputation in terms of anti-Semitism. So the truth is our enemies have feasted on Gaza. It's been the number one, piece of ammunition that they've held against us. So if you take that further out and you imagine a situation where Israel's enemies on its borders have been severely weakened, I can imagine a future Middle East where there are no 1,000 dead a week. There are no Gaza nightmares. There are no Gaza disasters that serve as ammunition against the Jews, where instead of Israel being a source of dead Palestinians, Israel becomes a source of ideas for Hollywood shows on Netflix. Israel becomes a source for helping the horrible drought in California because of its unique technology, that Israel becomes a place that can help with PTSD in the neighborhoods here in LA that have gang wars. Israel becomes a source for agricultural help, for food security. This is how I envision a more positive view of Israel. And at that moment, we will disarm the Jew haters. And I think Hollywood will be a lot likelier to follow the winners of Israel. And I see a future of Israel where Israel becomes the star of the Middle East. And I don't say this in a naive, idealistic way. If you just look at the the truth of why did the Abraham Accord become so successful? Because the countries of the Gulf states decided that they were going to put emotion aside and put practicalities front and forward and look at what they really needed. And when you do that, that's when Israel shines. When a country decides that they have 50 million people who need to drink and eat and have a good livelihood, that's when Israel shines. So I see a future when the emotion of hating Jews takes a back situation to the primary need, the human needs that we have. And on that front, Israel will look better, even here in Hollywood. That's the future. And I'm not making any of this up. You know why? Because it's all true. This cliche of startup nation, this idea that Hollywood goes to Tel Aviv to find great ideas for shows, it's all true. It's just been covered up, primarily by Gaza.
But David, just to pursue that for another minute, I don't have to rehearse the case for you or for JBS viewers, but in light of what you said, so Israel gets a bad name for seeking to defend itself against a genocidal enemy that has proclaimed repeatedly its intention to kill Jews and ultimately destroy Israel. An enemy that is listed as a terror organization by the United States government, by the way, under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, and a terrorist group that weaponizes civilians, knowing a priori that the more civilian fatalities, presumably, the more likely they are to gain support in Hollywood and other sort of places. And against that, yes, Gaza is a tragedy, but as you said, and I think we fully agree, Israel is not responsible for the tragedy in Gaza. It could have ended yesterday with Hamas ending its aims and releasing the hostages. So in the good times, yes to California agriculture and water management and AI and PTSD. But Israel also faces bad times. Is this inevitable? That we're not able to explain our need to defend ourselves in a survivalist mode?
As an expert in communication, I have to say, David, in many ways it is inevitable. Okay. There are certain situations where an argument doesn't really change people. If they have something ingrained in their mind that Israeli bombs and rifles and machine guns and tanks were directly responsible for the deaths of 30, 40, or 50,000 Palestinians, it's really hard to kind of shake that. I said to a friend of mine who's on TV a lot, I said, instead of trying to defend Israel, why don't you accuse Hamas of genocide against the Palestinians? There's something about defending yourself that always looks weak, even if you have all the facts on your side. And he said it's a good idea.
But
accuse Hamas. Israel is always being accused. Jews are always being accused, and it puts us on the defensive. So in terms of just the optics of communication, defending ourselves is not the most compelling thing. That, in fact, I can tell you that we have done that. I have thousands of emails to show you,
I'm sure,
that where we have pushback in Hollywood, defending ourselves on saying exactly what you were saying with the facts, and it still doesn't really help. Now, this is why I'm talking about the future, because this idea of thousands of Palestinians dying in Gaza, believe it or not, it's going to go away. And it has, in many ways, already gone away. And I just hope and pray for a situation when the hostages are finally released, when there's a government in Israel that really has an end game in Gaza, not one that has a forever war, which I'm really against. I'm really looking forward, because we have reached rock bottom. they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, you got to hit rock bottom before you can go up. As far as the situation in Gaza and Israel's kind of the price we've paid in Israel's reputation, it can't go anywhere but up because we've reached rock bottom. So this is why I look at a future when the other side of Israel will shine. But the other side of Israel can never shine as long as there's still a war going on in Gaza and as long as there are still Palestinians dying in Gaza.
I would just note, and Charles, I know you want to pick up presumably another theme, but there was a time, David, not that long ago in American history, where there was much greater moral clarity. And when the United States Air Force, joined by the Royal Air Force of the UK, bombed across Germany, and in the case of the United States, bombed Japan, including, of course, dropping 2 atomic bombs, for the majority of Americans, the clear majority, there was such moral clarity that they understood this was unfortunate, this was tragic, but this was necessary. Instead of moral clarity, in too many corners of America today, we have moral fog, moral confusion. It's not to extend the conversation, it's simply to make the point that you can be the successful winners, even with a high casualty rate, and still win the moral argument. We are the winners on the battlefield, but we have lost the moral argument, and we need to understand why.
Well, I think the moral clarity got obscured by deeper emotions. Among those deeper emotions are a hatred for America, a hatred for the West, a hatred for Trump. So when you have those kind of hatred, you're not thinking in moral terms. And when you consider people who are not white as always victims, right? You don't think in moral terms. I wrote a column this morning on use of the word evil. Nobody uses the word evil anymore, and I think one of the reasons is because it gets covered up by deeper emotions.
Right, moral relativism.
Yeah, exactly.
Charles, go for it.
No, exactly. Evil, good and evil is part of the sort of binary modernist view that postmodernity wants to deconstruct into narratives. And I think in terms of moral clarity, and I know you'll agree, the head of the octopus was the Iranian revolutionary regime. This was a regime that wants to destroy democracy, subjugate women, murder gay people, and of course, take the protocols of the Elders of Zion, inspired by Nazism and the Muslim Brotherhood, and destroy Israel and murder Jews around the world as they go out to destroy the West and destroy our basic democratic values and principles. So I think in terms of moral clarity, and I hope this will be branded, you're the expert of communications and branding, Israel just saved, I would even say, I'm choosing my words carefully, saved the democratic principles, did what Western leaders, the great Western leaders of Europe and North America, should have been doing decades ago. And Israel was put in a position to defeat Hamas, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, and now it looks like they've really decimated the powers of the Islamic revolutionary regime in Iran. And I think in terms of moral clarity, what Israel has done, what the Jewish people has done for democratic principles and human rights, and for the Iranian people, and for the Lebanese people, and hopefully for the Gazans and the Syrians, is remarkable. And I think...
Charles,
yeah.
You and I have been talking about doing a podcast for years. I've known you forever. And I never imagined that we would finally do the podcast on one of the, I have to say, one of the highest moments in Israel's history.
Yeah.
And I'm not exaggerating, because if you've just listed something that we need to pinch ourselves, because really you can have moral confusion among so many people, but in Israel there's no moral confusion at all. Absolutely moral clarity, what has happened in the Middle East. And I'm thinking just in the last year and a half, and especially in the last few weeks, is really an extraordinary development that gives hope for moral clarity.
Agreed.
So, predictions on the Abraham Accords, David?
You know, we have an analyst at the Jewish Journal, Dan Schnur, and he took a different take on this. He thinks that because Iran has been so weakened, that Saudi Arabia may not need Israel that much, because it was always seen, you know, the benefit of relationship with Israel, it would be like a common help against the big Iranian threat. So I don't know what to make of that exactly, but I do know that it would be wonderful for me to see the Abraham Accord, even if it takes 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. A vision of the Middle East where the Abraham Accords becomes the Mideast Accords, and the Middle East becomes like the European Union. We have a Mideast Union. And it sounds so idealistic because for the past century, we've seen such devastation in the region. But if you see the Persians in Iran, we know that 2/3 of them are kind of westernized. So if you envision a time when they're liberated and they start engaging in real needs and creating allyship, and you start having a domino effect, who knows? But as far as the Abraham Accords, you know, I have the view from my buddy Dan Schnur, but I also have the view that President Trump will really push for it. And I know that Netanyahu would love nothing better than to extend the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, which is the birthplace of Islam. So I'm not sure which way it's going to go, but I know where my heart lies.
And also, one of our analysts has a similar view. He's skeptical now that Iran is weakened and the Saudis may not need the Israelis as they did before. However, one possibility is if the Iranian people rise up and replace the regime, then perhaps, you know, a strong Iran or a free Iran could have good relations with Israel, which then these two entities would make Saudi Arabia may be predisposed to working with us as well. So there's hope.
And I'll go out on a limb here. Donald Trump is not setting the stage for something to happen 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road, David. Donald Trump is setting the stage for something to happen on his watch during his term, which will lead him as well to Oslo and the Nobel Peace Prize, which was denied him the first time. And Benjamin Netanyahu had a two-pronged strategy. Destroy Iran's capabilities on the one hand, and be the prime minister that opens the Israeli embassy in Riyadh. So I don't know whether it happens or not, but those are two very powerful forces working in the opposite direction of what your analyst suggested. And without picking sides analytically, aspirationally, I know what side I'm on. We're all on. Final question, if I may, because we're running out of time, but I don't want to let it go. When Charles introduced you, David, he said you were born in Morocco, and we haven't spent any time on that experience. I don't know how old you were when you left Morocco, but nonetheless, I'm sure that the Moroccan influence in your family was quite strong, even after you left Morocco. My wife was born and raised in Tripoli, Libya, and I know two things: a very strong sense of identity, Jewish identity on the one hand, and a continuous surprise at how few American Jews, not to mention other Americans, have any clue there were ever non-Yiddish speaking Jews anywhere in the world, including North Africa. So maybe some concluding thoughts about the Moroccan influence and how you see Morocco and the relationship to the Jewish people today.
You know, in Morocco, we were different than the rest of the Middle East. There was the king of Morocco, going back 3 generations, really loved the Jews, and he protected the Jews. It's part of the folklore of every Jewish Moroccan family, grows up hearing that the king loves us and protects us. So Morocco had a different kind of vibe than the experience of other Jewish refugees. The second thing about Morocco is that I didn't know about a thing called the Holocaust until I met Ashkenazi friends in Montreal. So I grew up with a different kind of Judaism, what I call the Judaism of the sun. I was not traumatized by the nightmare of the Holocaust. So the Judaism that I gained in Morocco was more a Judaism of optimism, a Judaism of dreams, a Judaism what I call of the sun. And that's kind of what I try to bring to the community with all the Ashkenazi part of me that needs to recognize reality. The second part that I bring is I understand that anywhere in the Middle East, if I'm a reporter or an editor of any kind of paper, and I write a column bashing the leader of my country, I can expect to have policemen show up at my door at night. I have written so many columns criticizing the leaders of America from the right and the left, and nobody's ever shown up in my house at night saying, "Follow us, Mr. Suissa." So that freedom of expression that I have in this country just reminds me how great this country is and how we shouldn't take those freedoms for granted.
Do you have any connection to Morocco today?
I do. I have a cousin still there, and I've gone back. I have relatives. I have friends. Absolutely. I mean, one thing I hear is that at its peak, it was almost 300,000 Jews in Morocco, and it's down to about 3,000. And there is a certain nostalgia and melancholy among many of the Arabs because they miss the Jews. And after the Abraham Accords, as you know well, thousands and thousands of Israelis would flock into Casablanca and Morocco every month. It's gone down, of course, since October 7th, but it's going to come back up. And I think that's a fascinating development because the Moroccans are entrepreneurial. So they started seeing this new look of Jews from Israel, and they're saying, these are not monsters. They're staying in our hotels. They're helping our economy, and they love to have fun. This is not the Israel we see on Al Jazeera. So it's part of the optimistic side of me, which is that the more contact there is, human contact, between Israelis and the rest of the Middle East, the more people will see that, no, Israelis are not monsters.
And the very last question, David, just in this context, if I may ask, why did your family choose to leave Morocco?
At the time, there was some tension. There was two great moments of tension. The first great moment was the State of Israel when it was created. And then the second was around the time of the Six-Day War.
Right.
Now, we left a little before that. I think there was a sense of where is the future lies. My father was a teacher in Morocco, and there was the classic Jewish story. Where do I want my kids to go to university, right? Where do I want them to be educated? And at some point, they had to make a decision. And there was Israel, France. Canada was very open to immigrants, and Quebec was 80% French. And the Jews of Morocco spoke French. And my father was a French teacher.
Voila.
And they gave him a job in Montreal. So we went from the Mediterranean weather to the North Pole overnight. That's how we ended up in Montreal.
Well, the North American
I
community
ended up learning Yiddish.
and the North American Jewish community has greatly benefited from your family's decision. With that, our time has run out, Charles and David. So on behalf of both of us, the Montrealer and the New Yorker, David, thank you so much, David Suissa, for joining us. And to JBS viewers, you've just been listening to David Suissa from the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles. Read him, subscribe to the paper, follow it, and I think you'll be very pleased you did. On behalf of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, on behalf of Charles Small and myself, David Harris, thank you for watching, and see you again next week.